The New York Rangers look to continue as an elite team despite some offseason losses. The Boston Bruins look to continue to contend, but is Jeremy Swayman ready to be the number one guy? And is the Vancouver Canucks blue line good enough to sustain their success? We've got all that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen today. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. It is my pleasure to welcome to the show the host of Locked On New York Rangers, John Chik. And John, it's been an interesting offseason so far for the Rangers. A lot of departures, and most of them expected. But out of all the players who left, which one concerns you the most?
There's nobody I think that's like overly concerning, because I think in most cases, most of the players that are now ex-Rangers, and no disrespect to anybody, I think everybody on that roster had a hand in them making it as far as they did this past playoffs, getting into the Eastern Conference Final before falling to the Panthers. But I feel like at just about every single position, whether we're talking about, Roslovic, he's going to be replaced probably by Riley Smith. I mean, that kind of seems like it's the way that they're going there, and Riley Smith will be in a top six role. If Philip Hedl is healthy, then he'll take over for Alex Wenberg. You got Zach Jones stepping into the lineup seemingly as a regular in place of Erik Gustafsson. And Barclay Goodrow, that's probably the one downgrade, as the fourth line center, going from him to Sam Carrick. But I think with Barclay Goodrow, the cap hit just was a little bit too high for somebody that largely plays on your fourth line. I do think of all the departures, maybe you'll miss him the most just because of the intangibles and the fact that it does feel like this guy always steps up come playoff time. He'll have like 2 or 3 goals in the regular season and then end up with 5 or 6 goals in the playoffs. That's kind of how he does it. And does a lot of the little things that maybe fly under the radar, a physical player and somebody that kills penalties as well. So if they're going to miss anybody, and he was an alternate captain on top of all that. So if they're going to miss anybody, I'd say probably Barclay Goodrow. But there's nobody that left that causes like a massive hole in the lineup or anything like that. So I think they'll be all right with some of the players that they've brought in to replace some of those guys that I just mentioned.
Yeah, it seems that way. Do you think they're still President's Trophy and Stanley Cup contenders at this point?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I was talking about this on my show where I was comparing this past season's opening night roster to what it looks like it's going to be for this season's opening night roster. And it goes back to what I was just talking about. I think in just about every position, the Rangers, either the player from last year is still here this year. The core is obviously still intact. So either that's the case or you're in a situation where they've probably upgraded, top line right wing. Again, I think that's the best example. Going from Jack Roslovic to Riley Smith, that to me feels like at least something of an upgrade. I don't think they're like massively better than last year's team, and nothing's guaranteed. They can be better on paper. It might not lead to them having the best record in the NHL again. The Metro Division is always tough. We know that. There's no guarantees that they'll repeat there either. But I think on paper, this team has gotten slightly better. I would have liked to have seen them add maybe a little bit more snarl and a little bit more grit to this team. Riley Smith is a fine player, but I would have preferred somebody that, maybe brings a little bit of that mix of skill and toughness to the top line. And, Smith has some skill. He's very good off the rush and all that stuff. And, solid player, but I feel like there were a couple of guys out there that maybe I would have liked a little bit more. That end up signing 1-year deals, guys like Anthony Mantha, Jason Zucker. I think they might have been better fits, but regardless, I'm excited, man. I think this championship window is still wide open, and something that gives me hope, and I've talked about this in my show, is, and again, none of this guarantees anything, but you look at recent NHL history, a lot of teams over the last few years have kind of been knocking on the door, and then they finally kicked it down, whether it's the Knights, Tampa Bay Lightning ×2, they won 2 Stanley Cups. The Avalanche for a while were always, had one of the best records in the league, couldn't really get past the second round. They recently won a Stanley Cup. If you want to go back a little bit farther, you look at the Capitals. They for years were the team that couldn't do it in the playoffs until they did. So, yeah, man, look, they lost the Panthers. Panthers won fair and square. I don't think that series was as one-sided as a lot of people would have you believe. And I think the Rangers are right there and still among the elite teams in this league.
Do you think if there is one area you think that this team could tweak whether it's before the season starts or even up until the trade deadline. As of right now, what does that look like?
As far as like an adjustment that they would make, I mean, I feel like this is their team. You know, we'll see what happens when the trade deadline rolls around, but you might be in a situation where you get to this year's trade deadline where you're looking to bring in one more big time forward, you know, somebody that can score. Maybe you go in a different direction. Maybe you bring in somebody that can add a little bit more grit to this team. Overall, though, you know, I feel like they've put together a good roster here, and I don't think any like massive changes are going to happen, certainly between now and the start of the regular season. When the trade deadline rolls around, you know, we'll see who's on the roster and how much cap space accrues. But yeah, I would look for them to be active at the trade deadline and add some complementary pieces around that time. You know, however they're doing, certainly I think they'll be in contention and they'll be a team looking to buy. And I think, you know, you'll see them pounce at the trade deadline as they have in recent seasons.
Any up and coming prospects that you have your eye on in training camp?
Yeah, Brandon Offman for sure. I talked about this, I think, on the most recent episode that I did. You know, 3 Ranger prospects that have the best chance of making an impact on the Rangers for this upcoming season. Brandon Offman, for anybody that might not be familiar with that name, first round pick for the Rangers, I believe number 16 overall a couple of years ago, 2021. And he's a left winger, but he can play a little bit of right wing as well. He was up for 3 games last year, and then they sent him back down to the AHL. But I think that was always the plan. They just wanted to get him a little bit of a taste of NHL action. He got it last year, and I think this year he'll be given every opportunity to make this team out of training camp. And even if that does not happen, you got to believe that when the Rangers need a spark or they're just looking to call somebody up, if he performs well in the AHL this year as he did last year, he'll be one of the first guys that they call. And somebody who, I talked about this a minute ago, but he has that intriguing blend of skill and toughness. This guy is a wrecking ball out there, despite not being, necessarily the biggest player on the ice. And he's got some skill as well. He set the OHL on fire when he was there, put up a bunch of points in his first season with the Wolfpack last year too. So I think he's the guy. And I'll give an honorable mention also to Brett Berard, former 5th round pick. Doesn't have the hype and the, hoopla surrounding him the way that Offman does, but this is a guy that's just progressed really nicely, good all-around game. And again, a little bit of a mix of, the skill and the toughness that I think Ranger fans everywhere like. So he's my honorable mention, is Brett Berard.
Got to mention this, just announced earlier this week that Sam Rosen, who has been doing Rangers television play-by-play for 40 years, is going to be stepping down at the end of this season. Wanted your thoughts about Sam Rosen, his legacy with the Rangers, and what his retirement means to Ranger fans.
Yeah, the guy's a franchise icon. I mean, there aren't too many announcers really in hockey or any other sport where you look throughout the history of broadcasting, no matter how much success, an announcer might have, there's always some naysayers. There's always that group of fans that's like, oh, I don't really like that guy, or I don't really like that person, right? It's not really the case with Sam Rosen. I mean, every once in a while, you'll find a contrarian who is just doing that. They're just going against the grain for the sake of going against the grain. But as far as like universally beloved sports broadcasters, I mean, I feel like he's up there. Ranger fans love him. He obviously has a lot of passion for his job. He's been doing it, as you mentioned, for 40 years. And we're really going to miss him. He's got some iconic calls. Nobody will ever forget the 94 Stanley Cup where, the waiting is over. The New York Rangers are the Stanley Cup champions, and this one will last a lifetime. I mean, every Ranger fan on the planet can say that verbatim. Another good one was a couple of years ago, single overtime against the Pittsburgh Penguins in Game 7. But, I mean, he was just thrilled about that win as well. And, we're certainly going to miss him. But we were talking about this a second ago off air, Gil. I'm glad that at least we know that, like, okay, this is going to be his last year. I wouldn't have wanted to see the announcement that, like, oh, he's done. He's just not going to come back. Like, at least we know now that we can get used to it. And, just enjoy this last season with Sam Rosen as the play-by-play guy for the New York Rangers. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, he certainly deserves that victory lap, that send-off. Every time I've met him, he has been a class act and a great guy, and he is an institution here in the New York area. John, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, anywhere you're listening to this or watching this, you can find Locked On New York Rangers there as well. We're on every audio streaming platform you can think of, also on YouTube. And you can find me on social media, on Twitter, at JChik17. Give me a follow, talk some hockey, have some fun, get excited for the season. Definitely looking forward to watching some Ranger hockey.
All right. Well, just a month away from training camp. John, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work with Indeed. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with quality candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will gain a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked-on. Just go to Indeed.com/locked-on right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Boston Bruins, Ian McLaren. And Ian, been a very busy, eventful offseason. And I guess outsiders would be concentrating more on some of the players the Bruins lost this offseason. Out of all of those guys, who concerns you the most?
I mean, I guess the guy that you would look at first and foremost is Linus Ullmark. I wouldn't classify that as a loss per se, seeing as the Bruins actively decided to trade him to the Ottawa Senators, but subtracting him from the roster is certainly going to be an issue for this team. We'll talk about that later on when we discuss the goalie situation. In terms of actual losses, guys who chose to move on and sign elsewhere, Jake DeBrusk obviously is a big one. He had been drafted by the Bruins, developed by the Bruins, didn't quite reach his offensive potential as a member of the Boston Bruins, but he became a very valuable two-way forward for this team. And he, along with Danton Heinen, who both signed with the Vancouver Canucks, those are two big losses for this team, especially on the wing. Now, they did add Elias Lindholm, who is going to be, a foundational player down the middle for this team for the next several years. But Jake DeBrusk specifically had, just a couple years ago, he was one of their most productive players when he was positioned alongside Brad Marchand and Patrice Bergeron. Had a very successful stint there, and losing him, especially, again, a guy they had drafted, developed, he had played his whole career there. That's a pretty big loss for the Bruins, for sure.
How about Pat Maroon? How do you feel about that loss, and how do you replace a guy like that?
Yeah, he was only here for a brief time, and his tenure with the Bruins was kind of tempered by the fact that he was coming off back surgery. It didn't play a whole lot, but he became a pretty instant fan favorite for this team, which is pretty wild considering just a handful of years ago, he was one of the fan base's mortal enemies with the St. Louis Blues and leading them to a Stanley Cup. And even in his time back with the Tampa Bay Lightning, they brought in a couple of younger guys to play in the bottom six. A guy like Max Jones, they're hoping could maybe fill that role with a bit more upside. Mark Kostelik, who was part of the Linus Ullmark trade, he's going to be given a shot to play on the fourth line and perhaps fill that more physically intimidating part of Pat Maroon's role. He was really embraced by the team, by the teammates. Even Brad Marchand as captain really said he enjoyed having him around. And Pat Maroon himself even said he had one of the best times of his career in that short stint, which says a lot considering he's a multi-Stanley Cup winner. That was a tough loss, kind of a short and sweet time there. But everybody's kind of moving on from Pat Maroon at this point as well.
Talk to me about the Ullmark trade. Were you pleased with the return that the Bruins got, and what is the new goalie situation going to look like?
I think the Bruins getting back a first-round pick, that was the whole impetus for making the trade. And they actually got back the pick that they had originally owned that had come to the Senators by way of the Detroit Red Wings, and that had been part of the Tyler Bertuzzi trade. So getting a first-round pick, it was still a bit of a later first-round pick, but to get back in the draft to kind of help restore some of the pipeline, and to get a guy like Kostelic, who's a versatile winger, bottom six guy. And then, of course, the kind of surprising bit in the trade was getting Joonas Korpisalo back in the deal from the Ottawa Senators. My picture for this trade was to be kind of dumping that $5 million on the remaining year of Ullmark's contract and kind of reinvesting that in Jeremy Swayman contract, something that still remains up in the air at this point. But to bring Korpisalo back at, the Senators retain, but they're still on the hook for 4 years at $3 million. That to me was an eyebrow raiser, and really hoping that goalie coach Bob Essensa can work some of the magic that he showed in the past. You look at the Bruins goaltending situation over the past 15 years, and it's been almost immaculate. And that's really due to goalie coach Bob Essensa and his work with these guys. So hopefully Korpisalo can turn things around and be at least serviceable backup, because if not, that contract could become pretty problematic fairly soon. So overall, I was glad to get back in the first round. My vision again was that, okay, you dump Ullmark and then you immediately sign Swayman with that savings. That didn't come to pass. They still have Korpisalo on the books for quite a while, and the Swayman contract still has not been signed, so hasn't quite fallen into place as I expected it would have.
How do you envision the starts being divided this year between Swayman and Korpisalo?
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of years it had been a almost even split between Ullmark and Swayman, but based on Korpisalo's performance last year with the Ottawa Senators, I would think that Swayman would at least be in line for 50 starts this season, and perhaps more of a 65-35 split or a 70%, 30% split. And I think that actually is coming into play in terms of the contract negotiations. Jeremy Swayman, everybody with eyeballs can see that Jeremy Swayman is a 1A goalie who NHL Network just ranked him as the 4th best goalie in the NHL right now. But we haven't actually seen him pick up the ball and run with it, or he hasn't been given the opportunity to get an extended run of starts. So maybe the Bruins are thinking, well, we need to see that in action before we commit 9, 8, 10, whatever $1 million. So it's kind of a catch-22 at the moment. But I mean, based on how Korpisalo played last year, how Swayman has played over the course of his career, especially in the playoffs last year, I'd be giving him at least 2 out of every 3 starts here for the Bruins this coming season.
The Bruins have been a veteran team, a team that has won consistently in the past decade. Are there any breakout players, young guys who have a shot at making this roster and having an impact this year?
Yeah, the guy you look at right away is Fabian Lysell. Like I mentioned, with DeBrusk leaving, there's a really big hole in the top 6 for this team right now. There's an opportunity for a guy like Fabian Lysell, who was drafted in the first round a few years ago, got a year in junior. He's got a couple of years in the AHL under his belt, and he should be ready to jump in and challenge for a spot, perhaps alongside Marchand and Charlie Coyle on the team's second line. So that's a guy who could step in and make an impact right away. He's got all the offensive tools. He was kind of questioned last year for his two-way play. I mean, he's only 21 years old. Takes time to develop that part of his game as well. But in the right spot, I think he could break out. A guy like Trent Frederick as well. He's been kind of limited on a third line role. Hasn't really got a lot of power play time, but with DeBrusk gone, with James Van Riemsdyk questionable as well, as unsigned. Maybe he comes back at some point on a PTO or when the Swayman contract is resolved. But if Frederick can get into the top 6 and can get some power play time, he's the guy that could really break out this season for the Boston Bruins as well.
All right, Ian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
The podcast is available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube. Just look up Locked On Boston Bruins, Locked NHL Bruins on social media, and people can find me at Ian C. McLaren.
Ian, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, no problem, Gil. Always great to catch up.
Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Canucks, Trevor Beggs. And Trevor, strong season for Vancouver, surprised a few people last year. But what will it take after these offseason moves for them to take that next step and go on a longer playoff run? Do you think that the offseason moves they made helped them in that regard?
Yes and no, Gil. As you know, life is it ain't black and white. It's complicated, especially talking to an Islanders guy like yourself who cheers for the Green Bay Packers. You know that life is complicated.
Yes.
And with the Vancouver Canucks, I think, they made some good moves this offseason, but there's still some question marks, right? Even for a team that, I'll put my bias aside, I still think this is a top 5 team in the NHL entering the regular season here for 2024-25. I think they did a really good job of increasing the depth at forward. I love the signing of DeBrusk. At the time, I was a little skeptical on the term, but for the dollar amount they're paying him, he doesn't have to be a superstar. If he's just a solid top 6 guy, it's going to work out. The additions of Heinen and Sprong and Sherwood at bargain basement prices, I think those are all guys who are going to be key contributors for this team next season as well. I think all of them can kind of punch up the lineup in a way that Nils Höglander did last season. So the depth at forward is pretty phenomenal, to be honest. I think it's one of the deepest, 12 sets of forwards in the league. On defense, I think it's a bit of a different story. You let Zadorov walk, and I know it was a lot of money, and I know it was a lot of term, but now you kind of have Tyler Myers back in a top 4 role, Derek Forbort, who Boston Bruins fans are, cheering and dancing when this guy doesn't re-sign with their team, and then Vinny Desharnais, who Canuck fans got a good look at this guy in the playoffs, and I know analytically he was good in the regular season, and I've been more impressed with some of that tape, but I did not think he was good in that series against the Vancouver Canucks. So the defense on paper is worse. The forwards on paper are better. But the great equalizer for the Canucks is, of course, Thatcher Demko in net. I mean, he was so good in the regular season. Goaltending's weird. We've seen it even with Demko, but I think this is a guy that if the Canucks don't overplay him, and they shouldn't based on what Shelovs did, this should be a team that continues to be one of the best teams in the NHL next season.
So here's my question, playing devil's advocate here. Great regular season. You mentioned the deep forward, the questionable blue line. Is this team built more for the regular season than for the postseason?
That's a great question. I think the way that the Canucks have put this team together, they are putting a lot of trust in the coaching staff to develop the defense and to being one of the best blue lines in hockey. And again, like I said, on paper, the defense is worse. I don't think there's any question about that. But I also think this coaching staff deserves the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. Because, last season, if you told me that Tyler Myers was going to be resurrected at the age of 34, I would have laughed in your face. To me, that was, the craziest story on the Canucks last season. This blue liner who they've been paying top pairing dollars for, and he was a replacement level player for the better part of 4 years. Yeah. This guy finally snaps out of it and plays like an actual, low-end top 4 defenseman. I mean, that was a phenomenal turn in his game. Noah Juleson as well. And Nikita Zadorov got way better. Carson Soucy looked great. I mean, I think the wonders that this coaching staff did with the defense makes me think that if they can continue that same magic this season, that this team is built for the playoffs, because you need depth. And I think, again, if the coaching staff, that's the kind of the big X factor, I guess, for the Vancouver Canucks, is if the coaching staff can continue to work wonders, make miracles happen in Vancouver with that defense, then, the Canucks are going to be, well, in a good spot entering the playoffs.
You mentioned Thatcher Demko, obviously a great story and a great goaltender. How many games do you think he should start, and how should they balance the need to win every game and yet the need to have him fresh come the stretch drive in the playoffs?
Yeah, it's much more important to have him fresh for the stretch drive. I think for me, no more than 55 games. Look, you got a guy in Shilovs who, and it's interesting because I honestly thought Shilovs was not that impressive in the AHL last season when I watched him. Like, very pedestrian. Had some great games, but had some pretty bad moments as well. But he's shown that on the big stage he can handle it, right? He's done it internationally. He did it for the Canucks in the postseason last year. I think you got to, trust Shilovs and give him, 30 starts this season, right? Because we've seen with Thatcher Demko, and I've been pumping Thatcher Demko's tires for the better part of a decade since he was drafted. I've been a huge fan of this guy and his style, his that psychology degree. He's got the great demeanor. I mean, his technique. He's a fantastic goaltender, but he's gotten injured almost every season. So you cannot overplay this guy. That's probably the absolute no-no for the Canucks next season. Do not overplay Thatcher Demko. Use Archer Shilovs. Use Yuri Patera if you have to. He looked okay in a couple of games last season for Vegas. But you got to keep Thatcher Demko healthy for the stretch drive, because I think there's a solid argument. Again, you're talking to Locked On Canucks, maybe a biased host here, but if Demko's in the net for that playoff run, I think the Canucks have a good chance of beating the Oilers and going to the Cup Finals.
That close. What is your biggest concern about this team now that training camp is less than a month away?
I'm trying to give you something other than the defense, but it's definitely the defense. Look, Carson Soucy now is your number 3, right? And this is a guy who has not been really a top 4 defenseman at all in his NHL career. Even last year in Vancouver, he was more of a bottom pairing guy. Tyler Myers, can he be as good as he was last season? I think that's a stretch. And these are the guys you have penciled into your top 4 right now. And I think with the Canucks, what they did last year is, they basically had a top 2 and a bottom 4, right? Like Hughes and Hronek played a ton, and then your other 2 pairings are more or less third pairings. And that strategy can work for the Canucks. But again, if one of those guys goes down, or maybe the coaching staff can't coach this defense like the way they did last season, there's going to be problems for this hockey team. But I think kind of the remedy there is, and again, this is crazy for Canuck fans to say, because through the Benning era, 10 years of bad moves and lack of trust, there's a lot of trust in this management, this coaching staff right now. And I think if the defense, if things aren't quite going the Canucks way on defense this season, they got a bit of cap space. They got some extra forwards to dangle. I think you're going to see Patrick Allvin, who's been one of the busiest general managers in the league, make a move to rectify a problem on defense if it becomes a problem.
You talk about defense. Are there any possible prospects or young guys who are ready to step in, whether it's on the blue line or up front?
Yeah, I mean, the Canucks prospect pool certainly isn't one of the stronger ones in hockey. It's definitely, I would say, quantity over quality. But obviously, the X factor next season is Jonathan Lekkerimäki. And I think now with what they did in free agency, there's a very slim chance that he suits up or at least starts in the NHL next season. But he's the Canucks' most talented prospect, bar none. And he's going to play in Abbotsford. He's going to be an option for them. If he has an insane training camp, I think there's not a slim chance that he could join the Canucks next season. And aside from that, it's probably guys who are, your tweener types, bottom 6 type. I know on defense, there honestly isn't a ton. Kyle and I kind of went through, the defensive depth chart, and you're looking at guys like Christian Wolanin and Guillaume Brisebois. None of these are really prospects, right? There's the Elias Pettersson 2.0, but, he's just going to be in his first full season in North America. I don't think he's really an option. Cole McWard, who may be like a Chris Tanev, maybe, but he's still a young guy. So no big prospects on defense. And at forward, aside from Lekkerimäki, again, you're looking at guys pushing for bottom 6 roles. I mean, Archie Baines was a great story last season, the most talented player on the Abbotsford Canucks roster. Great story. They're proud of Surrey, BC, where I'm currently recording this podcast from. No bias, okay? But Archeap, I think, has a lot of skill in his game. Played a lot of PK in Abbotsford, and I think he's got a chance of being a call-up option again. With the signings they made, I don't know if any of these guys have a huge chance, but he's got an option. And I guess the last guy I should mention is Vasily Podkolzin, who it's kind of a make or break year, right? Like after the signings they made in free agency, this guy doesn't really have a spot among the 12 forwards on this team right now. He's got to have a heck of a training camp. I believe he's waiver eligible too now. So this is a make or break time for Vasily Podkolzin as well. Former top 10 pick 5 years ago now.
Wow, 5 years. It's time. It is time. So, Trevor, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they can find the podcast and where they can find you on social media?
You can find Locked On Canucks wherever you listen to podcasts and, of course, on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also follow my co-host. I hear he's posting on TikTok. I'm too old for that, but my co-host Kyle Bowen, Bhawan, posting lots of Canuck stuff on TikTok as well. That's where you can follow us. Thanks, Gil. Appreciate you asking me that.
Thanks, Trevor. Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. For your second listen, enjoy Locked On NHL Prospects. Locked On NHL Prospects brings you the latest on all the best players outside the NHL, players in juniors, in college, overseas, who are going to be the future of the game. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guests. I want to thank John Chik of Locked On New York Rangers. I want to thank Ian McLaren of Locked On Boston Bruins and Trevor Beggs of Locked On Canucks for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we are here every Monday through Friday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the National Hockey League. So make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.